This is a lecture on participatory vendor selection. This lecture focuses on the details of one-on-one interviews of group members. This lecture was put together by Professor Lemmy and narrated by Jonathan Duxbury. Vendor selection occurs through a 7-step process. Each of these 7 steps are further explained in the following slides. This section focuses on the process of one-on-one interviews. Other steps are described in a separate set of slides. The objectives of one-on-one interviews prior to group meeting is to prepare the participant for the group meeting and to get input necessary for constructing the straw model. By straw model, we mean a set of preferences that can be revised later in a larger group meeting. To construct the straw model, the attributes that can be used to make vendor selection must be specified. The group member should be asked to specify the attribute levels, and finally a scoring procedure should be identified that allows one to use the attributes and attribute levels to assign an overall score to the vendor. The procedures we use to score the vendors is based on multi-attribute value model. If each vendor was described in terms of n attributes, A1, A2, etc., AN, then the vendor would be assigned a score on each attribute, VA1, VA2, etc., VAN. The overall value of the vendor is a function of the value of the option on each attribute. Though value models allow us to quantify subjective concepts, the resulting numbers are rough estimates that should not be mistaken for precise measurements. In vendor selection, the numbers used in scoring various vendors should not be the focus of the activity. These scores are intended to offer a consistent method of tracking, comparing, and communicating rough subjective concepts. What matters is to use the numbers to facilitate bringing the organization to a consensus. There are 7 steps in the process of modeling the participants' preferences. Each of these steps are further discussed in the following sections. The analyst briefly says who he is, why he's talking to the decision maker, the purpose of vendor selection, and how he will go about using the results of the interview. This should be as brief as possible. An interview is going well if the analyst is listening and the decision maker is talking. If it takes 5 minutes just to describe the purpose of vendor selection, then something is amiss. It is important to establish that the analyst is a record keeper and a facilitator, and that the decision maker will provide the content and expertise. A good way of doing this is to ask the decision maker to introduce himself or herself by describing relevant experiences. This approach clarifies the roles of each party. Next, time should be allotted to allow the decision maker to speak of his expertise. Whether the analyst explicitly pauses to ask for the introduction of the decision maker or not, most people go through lengths to mention their accomplishments anyway. Asking for an introduction allows the decision maker to do so at the start of the conversation and not throughout the interview. After introductions, the analyst solicits the attributes that the decision maker thinks are important in vendor selection. The process starts with concrete examples. The decision maker is asked to think of a good and a bad vendor. Then the decision maker is asked to describe the difference of the two. In these discussions, it is important to use the words of the decision maker and not to paraphrase the ideas. After the analyst has identified some attributes, the decision maker is asked directly for additional attributes. If the decision maker has used the word markers in describing the difference of good and bad vendors, then the analyst may ask, "Are there other markers?" In the next step, the analyst arranges the attributes in a hierarchy from broad to specific attributes. For example, cost attribute may include sub-attributes such as license costs, costs of maintenance, and other costs. The hierarchical structure promotes completeness and simplifies tracking many attributes. The analyst should be careful about terminology. He should always use the decision maker's terminology, even if he thinks a reformulation would help. Thus, if the decision maker refers to criteria for vendor selection or to attributes of the vendors, then the terminology used by the decision maker should be adopted by the analyst to reduce confusion. When an analyst asks a question, he should formulate the question without jargon. The analyst should use prompts that feel most natural in the context of vendor selection. The analyst should take notes and not interrupt the decision maker's train of thought. The analyst should write the important points being made and return to them when there's a lull in the conversation. Not only does this help the recall of what the decision maker has said, but it also helps the analyst review matters while the expert is still available. Decision makers tend to list a few attributes, then focus attention on one or two. The analyst should actively listen to these areas of focus. When a decision maker is finished, review what has been said and attract attention to new areas that need elaboration. If the analyst does not understand a certain point, he should ask for examples, which are an excellent means of clarification. For instance, after the expert has described attributes of cost of a license, then the analyst may ask the decision maker to elaborate on something mentioned earlier, such as reputation. The decision maker may have mentioned reputation in passing when he was discussing cost, but by returning to this topic, the analyst makes sure that the important comments are not missed. Here are examples of attributes that might emerge after interviewing a decision maker. Some of the attributes mentioned by this decision maker may include ease of use, improve one or more business processes, most value for cost, fit with long-term business strategy, and so on. Note that these attributes are listed in the words that are used by the decision maker and are not paraphrased. For example, the analyst may be tempted to refer to strong testimonies from prior users as reputation. This is not reasonable. The analyst should stay with the way the decision maker has articulated various issues. There are 3 steps in identifying the levels of each attribute. First, the analyst asks for the decision maker to define the best and the worst level within each attribute. This gives a range of possible levels for that attribute. Second, the analyst asks the decision maker for additional levels in between best and worst level. Finally, the remaining levels are filled in by the analyst following the logic of the decision maker's division of the attribute into various levels. The levels of each attribute should be described in a comprehensive manner to cover the performance of all vendors on the attribute. A typical error in obtaining the best and the worst levels is failing to describe these levels in objective detail. For example, in assessing the value of the attribute ease of use, it is not helpful to define the level as easiest and hardest to use systems. The adjectives easy to use and hard to use should be defined. It is best to avoid using adjectives in describing levels, as decision makers perceive words like easy or best in different ways. The levels must be defined in terms of the underlying physical process measured in each attribute, and the descriptions must be connected to the nature of the attribute. Thus, a good level for the easy-to-use attribute might be, entering the average patient encounter takes less than 2 minutes, and the worst might be, entering the average patient encounter takes more than 5 minutes.